Okay, welcome everyone, good morning, and welcome to the first Productivities in Scotland Business Engagement event. We're very grateful for your support and for you being here today in the lovely lecture theatre, as you can all experience. My name is Professor John Tsoukalas. I'm the lead for the Productivity Institute in Scotland. What I'm going to do today is give you an overview of the agenda for the event, and then I will hand it over to our business chair, Caroline Carey, who will do a proper introduction. So today, as you know, we have a magnificent talk by Professor Mark Logan, who we are very lucky to have in our university community. We are looking forward to have a very lively and engaging session. There will be plenty of opportunities to ask questions at the end of Mark's presentation. So Mark will, after Caroline introduces the format of the event, and give you some background about the work of the Productivity Institute. We'll jump right to the main business, which is Mark's presentation. Then we'll have a break, then the second session, and then we'll move on to the Q&A session. There will be some opportunity to interact with each other and network. So over to you, Caroline.
A very warm welcome to the first event of the Productivity Institute in Scotland. I'm Caroline Curry, Chief Executive of Women's Enterprise Scotland and Chair of the Productivity Institute Board in Scotland. The Productivity Institute is a £32 million investment made possible by a grant from the Economic and Social Research Council, focusing on improving productivity and living standards across the whole of the UK economy. And we are delighted to be joined today by some of our UK colleagues, including the Managing Director of the Institute, Bart van Ark. Here in Scotland, we have an ambition to revitalise productivity, equipping our business leaders with the practical tools to drive business growth, and in turn supporting economic growth in local communities across Scotland. All this work has been made possible by my visionary colleagues at Glasgow University, led by Professor John Tsoukalas. John and the team will be analysing data and undertaking research to help businesses identify best practice in digital adoption and capitalise on operating with an efficient and scalable business model right from the start. But first, we are going to look at practical tips in tackling some of the enduring issues faced by scaling businesses. And it is my very great pleasure to introduce you all to the host of our first masterclass on practical productivity, Professor Mark Logan. Mark is a global technology leader, instrumental in the success of multiple startups, including as Chief Operating Officer of Skyscanner, one of Europe's most successful technology companies, where he was responsible for the general management of the business during a period of significant growth. For those of you that don't know, Skyscanner is a meta-search engine and travel agency used by 100 million people per month, and the business was valued at 1.75 billion in 2016. Who better than Mark to provide us with best practice insights on addressing some of the persistent and enduring issues faced by scaling businesses? So get your digital notebooks or traditional notepads all ready to capture the practical approaches and tools which could transform the future of your business. Professor Mark Logan, thank you for supporting our first event. We really look forward to hearing from you, and the floor is all yours.
And the word transform is often overloaded. I've used it nonetheless because people often doubt that it is possible to transform your productivity. And yet we've seen that it's very easy to transform your productivity from being pretty good to being really bad. So the question is, can we go in the other direction? And I strongly believe the answer is yes. And when I say transform, I don't mean get 10% better, but get 5 or 10 times more productive. That's what we're trying to achieve in our businesses in the context of today's discussion. And the other word is practical, because there's no point having a theoretical chat today. Everyone here is busy, got businesses with problems. How do we have practical things you can go and take away without going in a 9-month Six Sigma course or something like that? So that's what we're going to be trying to explore today. And Carrie mentioned Skyscanner. This was our journey in Skyscanner for a long period of time, and it looks from the outside like it was pretty kind of easy story. Everything just kept growing. We kept adding more users and all that. But the reality was it felt a bit more like this. Same curve, different physical experience. It was really difficult to keep the business working at different levels of scale, and we very, very frequently ran into scaling and productivity issues, where suddenly, despite having more people than we'd had before, our productivity would suddenly drop through the floor. And it was a real struggle to understand why that was. And I remember one situation where I was in Singapore visiting our team in Singapore, and I asked our new Japanese country manager, Fang how I could help her be successful. And her answer was this: well, you could tell me, Mark, why is it takes 6 weeks these days to fix a simple bug? And I was quite taken aback by that. So I asked her more about that, and she was saying to me that there's a spelling mistake, a translation error in the Japanese version of Skyscanner's website. And I've raised that, and it's quite an embarrassing one, and it's definitely going to affect performance of the product. So I've raised that and asked that to be fixed as a translation error, and it took 6 weeks for that to happen. And I was saying to her, no, that's not what I've heard. I've heard it takes 2 days to translate strings. And she said, well, the end-to-end experience, Mark, is 6 weeks. So I was quite troubled by that. And on investigating it and asking questions of the team, it became apparent that actually nobody in the company actually knew how long it took to run that process, and people only knew bits of it. So everyone thought it was okay, but the net customer experience was very, very poor and had degraded very rapidly over the last few months. And that's a very common experience. And we'll come back to that story as we go through our session today, but it leads to more sort of general questions that you often hear people asking each other in businesses. Like, why do things take so long is a very, very common issue. A very, very common one is, why were things faster when we were smaller? It's very common to hear founders of companies, for example, say, when there was just 3 of us, we got lots of stuff done around here, and now we don't. It must be the people we've hired. They must not be as good as I was when I was doing that work. Very, very common pathology. Then there's the question of how productive can we become? And we often anchor ourselves on our current productivity. So we could maybe get 10% better at this if we really tried. But if we were to ask ourselves, could we be 10 times more productive? Would that cause us to arrive at a different set of solutions and do a different set of things? So these are the general questions that are always in the air, I think, in a business that's striving to be successful and productive. So today we're going to try and break that down a little bit by, first of all, almost anatomizing the problems of productivity, and then looking at practical things you can do to solve for those, and then looking at how you can actually apply those techniques in your own environment. And I think there's really 2 things I'd like you to get from this session today, ideally. One of them is that these techniques themselves, which are illustrative of my point, are directly applicable to what you do. But the other is that I'd like you to think about the fact that you can generate your own such models and your own solutions, but that productivity is addressable, and there are ways you can dramatically improve the productivity of the company. And believing that takes you a lot further than when you believe you can't, which is where most of us start. So I'd like to just kind of challenge people a little bit to think about that. So let's get started with the first of these, which is the practical anatomy productivity problems. So how do we anatomize this space? Well, let's start by talking about not problems, but what's the essence of being a productive company? And it's really around this concept of iteration speed. How fast does the business execute one cycle? And how much of those cycles can it do at once? This is the essence of productivity. It's the essence of techniques like Agile. It boils down to this. And if you look at this ladder here, at the bottom, we're talking about the most direct form of iteration speed or productivity. How long does it take to execute a cycle of a process like fixing bugs or onboarding employees or onboarding new customers, etc. These are sort of very direct measures of how productive an environment is. Moving up from there, it's as important that the learning rate of the organization is rapid, because there's no business that I'm aware of that's in a static environment where things aren't changing. I think that's obviously very, very prescient given what we've all been through in the last year or so, but that's always been the case. So organizations that stay successful, effective and productive have a good cycle time on learning rate. How quickly do they learn from what the environment's telling them, either about the workflow going through an onboarding sequence in a product or shifts in the market away from your product set, those kind of things. And then of course, very tied to learning rate is adaptation rate. How quickly do we adapt to what we're learning? This is a different frequency than the other two, so it's not as fast, but it needs to be pretty fast. And then finally, how do we evolve? What rate at which do we evolve the company? So we've often heard people saying, what we used to do, how we're structured doesn't work anymore. But how quickly does a business actually adapt to that? So having a high iteration speed in these areas is the essence of productivity. And this actually comes from a theory called Boyd's law of iteration. Now, John Boyd was a military officer in the 1950s in the US military, and he noticed that at the time there were two fighter planes vying for supremacy. One of them was the Russian MiG-15, another was the American F-86. And by any measure, the MiG-15 was a much better aircraft than the F-86. It was faster, it could climb higher, it could turn more quickly. It was just a better aircraft, had better visibility and so on. But in 8 out of 10 dogfights, the F-86 would win. So that was quite a kind of strange kind of conundrum. And what John Boyd concluded was that the F-86 had a hydraulic joystick, so it was quite easy to turn the aircraft, whereas the MiG-15 had a sort of manual, it's operated joystick. So in a dogfight, the pilots of the MiG-15 got more tired operating this joystick and started to iterate less quickly and less often. So even though the MiG-15 was much better in every other regard, in a dogfight, the speed of iteration of the F-86 meant that it won most of the dogfights. And from that sort of theory comes the idea that speed of iteration beats quality of iteration. Now let's think about that. If you're an organization that iterates quickly and makes mistakes, you will win against an organization that doesn't make mistakes, but doesn't iterate quickly. And why is that? You'll discover, you'll experiment faster, you'll adapt more quickly. And if you do make mistakes because you're iterating so quickly, you will address those mistakes in a faster time than the original organization took to do the right thing in the first place. So it's obviously not to be taken to extremes, but it's an interesting thought that speed of iteration beats quality of iteration. It has many other cousins. In Facebook, they used to say done is better than perfect, for example, or let's move fast and break things. There's all different versions of that, but this is the essence of what Agile engineering is about and what productivity is about. And often, of course, we misunderstand that this is the essence. And I would urge everybody, whenever you're considering any methodology, is boil it down to the essence, not the trappings of it, but the essence. So for example, a very common mistake that lots of companies make is to have an organization that is structured however it might be structured and slowing down. And then to decide that you've heard on the internet or a consultant's told you that Agile will make you faster. And the way to get faster is to do sprints and have morning stand-ups and scrums and all that sort of stuff that comes with Agile. and then find you're actually less productive than you were before you went through that expensive transformation. And what you're doing there is you're just putting the trappings of Agile, the artifacts, those stand-ups, etc., on top of an organization that is slowing down. You haven't actually improved anything. You've just actually added a new layer of translation and bureaucracy. So to really get an Agile organization, you have to go back to this concept of, are we iterating as fast as we could in each of those different categories I showed earlier, from direct processes through to evolving the organization. So in Google, for example, Eric Schmidt, when he was the CEO, used to say that this organization speed is gated on the rate at which we make decisions. Even if they're the wrong decisions, it's okay because we'll decide to fix that mistake. And it's all the same principle. So don't get caught up in the trappings, focus on the essence. Now, with that said, therefore, there's a couple of traps to avoid. The first is agility in name only, which we just looked at. The other, though, is unguided fast iteration. So in anything I'm going to say today, which this won't be a surprise to anybody, but anything I'm going to say today, it's important to keep a balance. So just because something is good, it does not mean that if you do lots of it in isolation, it will be even better. So for example, in Skyscanner, we, as we learned how to be a fast iterating organization, we became very good at experimentation. So when I joined Skyscanner, we did one experiment every month, maybe, and we released software every 6 weeks. And through the efforts of many people, I'm not implying this is all to do with me, but as a team, we moved from that to releasing software hundreds of times a month and running hundreds of experiments. Now that let us start to iterate quickly, experiment quickly, learn quickly, adapt quickly, etc. And we used to celebrate that. We'd stand up at company meetings and say, look how fast we're iterating, look how many experiments we're doing. And it had a real effect on our performance. You can see in this graph here that Skyscanner is the blue line here, and towards 2015, when we really got good at this, we really started to pull away from our competitors. You can see Kayak's comparable performance, and even Google Flights at the time. And a big part of that was because we were iterating quickly as an organization, but then we started to celebrate that too much. So then people realized that if you run experiments around here, people think you're great. So people just started running arbitrary experiments. I'm going to move that a pixel to the left, and I'm going to change the light blue to a different shade of light blue, and their experimentation metrics went up, but they were starting to detach themselves from the strategic needs of the business. So you've got to keep these things always in line. It's a very important point. Always be critical of people like me when they tell you something's great. Now, so this is the secret of iteration, or the secret of productivity. What are the things that stop us doing this? We can't be exhaustive today, but I want to explore some areas that are fundamental to productivity or to stopping you having it, and then look at what we can actually do about it. And we're going to look at that from a couple of perspectives. The first is on the left here is the static perspective. So at any point in time, there's a gap, you can call it a productivity gap, between what we are currently doing, what we're capable of, and what we could be doing. Now, you don't necessarily know where what we could be doing is. Sometimes you know because you can compare yourself to competitors, etc. But you don't really know, but you perceive there's a gap. And part of what we have to do is reduce that gap. But the other problem is that even if we do that, things change around us. So let's look at each of these areas. And on the first of these, the static view that we've just been talking about, I'm going to cover 4 areas today. And again, this isn't an exhaustive treatise of the landscape of productivity, but I think it will hopefully give you a sense for how to think about these things. And the first of these is throughput problems. Now, every business has lots of processes. I often hear businesses say, oh, we don't like processes, we don't have processes. Yes, you do, you just haven't admitted it yet and you haven't formalized them, but everybody has processes. Things like hiring people, finding customers, building product, fixing products, service calls. These are all of them are processes. Some are more important than others, but they're all processes. And processes have 2 things. They have a throughput, how fast do we execute in terms of getting the number of items through that process, number of customer tickets, for example, and how long does it take one item to go through, that's the latency. And very often in a business, those things suddenly slow down and sometimes slow down catastrophically. So we've got to be good at fixing that problem. So we're going to look at that today. The next thing is decision bottlenecks. Now, very often you'll see an organization with 200 people in it, but only 2 or 3 people gate the speed of that organization because they own too many decisions. So everybody knows that's wrong, but everybody ends up in that position. So why is that? So how do we solve for that? So we're going to look at that today. The next one is conflicting imperatives. Now, this idea is that we all agree we've got a goal as a business, but Team A thinks that what we need to do to fulfill that goal is something that's actually in conflict with something Team B thinks we need to do. Either conflict for resources, but more likely conflict of ideas. A lot of time is wasted in businesses with teams fighting with each other because I think we should do it this way and John thinks we should do it that way, and we start to fall out with each other because we start to personalize it and all that stuff. This hasn't happened between John and I, but just as an example. So that's an extremely important one, very, very common issue. And the final one we'll look at is path dependence. Now, however, I've expressed this as things suck and we know they suck, and we go home at night and complain to our partners that they suck, and we go down the post or pre-COVID pub and complain to our colleagues that they suck, and then we go back in the next day and do the same stuff. And none of us are idiots, but very commonly we do that. I always like the phrase, none of us is as dumb as all of us. So individually, we always try and hire the smartest people, but we put us all in a room, then we do dumb stuff like this. Why is that? And it really, of course, affects productivity because it affects our willingness to improve our productivity. So we're going to look at that as well. So, even if you don't do those things, even if everything's working really, really well, so we've sorted the static issue and people are high-fiving. I don't know if you've ever been in a meeting where people do this. I haven't, but apparently, according to the internet, it happens. But then the business grows or something changes externally and suddenly everyone looks like this. It's a very, very common problem. Things were going really well and now they're suddenly not. And not only are they not going well, they're going awfully badly. So that takes into this issue here, which is that when you grow an organization, so we're now into the dynamics of productivity, then that growth often breaks the organization in some way, which in turn breaks your growth. So you get stuck and you plateau. And every so often you make progress and you fall back down again. So if we're going to study productivity, we have to understand not just the static issues associated with it, but also why does it break so easily under dynamic pressure? So both those things are important. So another way of putting that is whatever works for you today will break tomorrow, which is quite a sobering thought when things are going well. I was always at my most nervous in any business when things were going really well, because I knew that was just the beginning of the decline into problems. So, be conscious of that. And the way that happens is that, let's imagine we have a business and we're employing people along the x-axis and we're trying to measure outcomes in the y-axis. Outcomes are things we want to do as a business, ship product, sell stuff, whatever it is. And what we expect to happen when we hire people, what we want to happen is at least the green line. We add more people, we get more outcomes. But what we'd love to happen is just a dotted line. We get disproportionate more outcomes for the people we add. So that's what we expect to happen. What does happen though is this. We tend to find that we get to about 30 to 50 people, and we're still adding people, but things are starting to level off. We're actually getting no more done for the same number of people. And these inflection points are extremely difficult to avoid and extremely difficult to get out of. And this is what I mean by the dynamics of productivity. And usually what happens is the business stays there for a while and then declines along one of the dotted axes because a competitor who gets through that problem takes them out. Very, very common issue. If you are lucky to get through this, you'll find that it happens again, and it's happening because at each stage, if you think about what is an organization, it's these three things. It's people, processes, and structures. So how capable are the people we have? What processes do we ask them to operate, and what structures do we ask them to do it within? And every inflection point that we hit is because these things have scaled out in some fashion. To take a really simple example, I'm a great team leader of 3 people, but I'm really bad at managing 10 people, and you didn't invest in my ability to do so. So now I've made the team unproductive. Just one example. So what you end up with is this kind of pattern here that at regular intervals, you'll hit new inflection points if you manage to survive the first ones. And it's almost geometric. You can predict your next inflection point. So at Skyscanner, for example, we hit these ones, but we also hit one at 400 people and at 800 people. And you kind of know they're coming, but you don't know exactly when. And I've found that you don't know you're in them until you've been in them for a very long time. And it's very hard to get out of them because the human nature is to double down on what used to work. So you tend to stay in them for a very, very long time. So dynamics are really, really important in this whole piece. And what makes this worse is that as the business grows and as executives and leaders get busier, we start to replace thinking with acting and reacting because it's easier. We don't like thinking, if we're honest. It's very expensive in terms of energy, so we don't like to do it. Evolutionary principles apply here. Don't waste energy if you don't have to. So we tend not to think if we can possibly avoid it. Most of what we do is about acting and reacting to stuff. And that is problematic when you're having these scaling issues that I've just been talking about. And why is that? Well, let's look at the time of an individual contributor, somebody who doesn't manage people. This is what it looks like. You get periods of contiguous time to work on stuff, and then you've got a meeting perhaps. But as you become more senior, whatever means, your time gets more and more time sliced. So not only is it convenient not to think, you actually don't have time to think. You're at the top level there, your calendar's full of status meetings and board reports and all that sort of stuff. So that's very problematic, because the way that if you're this person here, for example, the problem that you face is this, which is in your business, as we add more people, the difficulty index of managing that business goes up. Other things affect that too, like more customers, more complexity of customers, and so on and so forth. And if I was to ask someone, let's say Nuran and I started a business tomorrow, and there was a problem, and we are here on the graph, just at the foot of it. If I was to say to Nuran, why do you think we're having trouble selling that thing? Nuran would say, I think it's because of this. And she'd answer me right away, and she'd almost certainly be right. At this point in the business, because the business is relatively simple, the gap between the plausible answer that Nuran's given me and the actuality is zero. And then the business starts to grow. And that gap between plausibility and actuality starts to grow, because Nuran and I are far too busy now fighting fires and all that sort of stuff. So now if Nuran asks me, why do you think that customers are switching off my product? I'm successful because I've learned to give sensible answers quickly. That's what makes me a successful leader in this business. So I'll give Nuran a plausible answer. I think it's because we're not properly mobile, or I think it's because we need to buy Salesforce so we can spot better customer leads. It all sounds very plausible, but it's almost certainly wrong. The gap between plausibility and actuality is growing, so our ability to think our way through the problem is constrained by our lack of time and by the fact that we've trained ourselves to give plausible answers, but now we're in a different environment where thinking is required. So it's very, very important to remember that plausibility, the stuff people tell you, is almost certainly not actually true, and you need a better method than just you're quite smart and sharp, so you can give sensible, plausible answers to stuff. Most of management's discourse in our country is based on plausibility rather than actuality, unfortunately. In my view, I can't prove that, but that's what I've experienced. So that takes us to this problem. So returning to our discussion now, so we've got two types of problems, static and dynamic, and we're going to look at both of those. And we're now going to look at how do we actually solve for these things. And we've got a break at just after 11. So we're going to look at a couple of these points first, then we're going to take a break and look at the other ones. So let's start off with thinking about the sort of top level picture here. So here's an equation. Restoring and increasing productivity is a function of time and technique. So that's all you need to know about this equation. There's nothing else to worry about there. So let's look at time, first of all. Now, we've talked about this issue here, where we don't have enough time. There's two types of time. There's maker time and there's manager time in this world. Now, manager time, and neither of these are pejorative terms, by the way. Manager time is, I want a time slice between a set of meetings, status reports from my team, stuff like that. And we need that in our lives. We need to go and check in with the team and so on. So everybody, regardless of whether or not you are a manager, needs manager time. The problem is, in our modern corporate environment, people have too much of that type of time and not enough maker time. What is maker time? Maker time is contiguous hours of uninterrupted work or working deeply with someone else on something, but no meetings or emails to answer, that sort of stuff. So if you want to get deeply into why things break or why things aren't productive or why anything, in fact, you've got to have maker time. And that's the thing that we starve ourselves of. It's like a bad diet with no vitamins. And if you want to create the conditions to restore productivity, you've got to restore maker time into the diaries of your people, including and especially your senior people. So for example, someone in this situation is not going to be able to solve the problems you're asking them to solve. I remember when I was in Skyscanner, at one point I found myself with 21 direct reports. My fault, I hadn't addressed the organization properly in that regard. And I suddenly realized I'd become an administrator. I wasn't valuable anymore in terms of solving problems. I was just, I was totally fungible. You could put anyone else in that position and manage that status reporting. That's being a bit harsh, but that's kind of pretty much where I'd ended up. And I realized that what I had to do was push maker time into my calendar. So I took every Friday afternoon completely free of meetings after that, so I could think about stuff, sometimes walk in the park and think about stuff, but get more deeply into issues. And it made a dramatic difference to my effectiveness as an executive. And eventually we rolled maker time through the company so that we had meeting free Wednesdays. So unless there was a kind of fire somewhere, you couldn't have meetings outside your small group of, a few people you worked with. And people loved that because it was such a release and such a relief, and you can actually do deep work. And that's the thing we often get wrong in businesses. We don't create an environment, especially for our senior people, because they think they don't need it, to get deeply into issues. And I would urge everybody to make time for maker time. And that's our first sort of, lesson for today, is make room for maker time. And that will be difficult. People will tell you why it can't be done, but it's a choice between being productive or continuing as you are. And I think you've got to optimize for the right things. So that's time. Let's say we've now got time sorted out. The trouble is, how do we use that time? If we don't know how to use that time, then it's wasted time. So that then takes us to the question of technique. Now, technique is basically just how to think. How do you think about stuff? Plausibly, quick answers to stuff, or more deeply. And we want to think about thinking more deeply. And with the right tools, the right techniques, you can essentially significantly increase your practical intelligence. And that's what we want to look at, the bicycles of the mind that, Steve Jobs talked about in relation to the computer. There's also the bicycles of the mind that are things you carry with you. So, because otherwise we fall into this gap here. We're trying to shrink the gap between plausible and actual. So let's go back to this diagram here. We're going to start to look at these issues. And we're going to start with throughput problems. Now, this one's extremely important because, as I said earlier, every business has lots of processes in it. And usually they're going wrong, they're going too slowly in some fashion. And often you end up in this situation where you start a business, you've got a few processes, more people join, more complexity gets added. And eventually you find a situation where the processes are slowing down and you don't know why, nobody knows why. And this is worse than it seems, because especially in a growing business where you're adding more people or trying to put more things through a process, more customers or more new employees or more bugs, that often this isn't a linear decline. It suddenly is a catastrophic decline. And suddenly there's a crisis in the business. And then you say to people, why do you think that's happened? And guess what? We're in the land of the plausible. So people say these kind of things. And you'll notice a lot of these are blaming other people. And that's our first reaction. The reason things aren't working because those guys in floor 2 are a bunch of idiots. I mean, everybody knows that, right? Are they? I've heard that lots of times, and then I've gone to floor 2 and realised it's the guys in floor 1 that are idiots. It's a very, very common problem. We anthropomorphize blame. We blame people rather than the system. So these are all plausible statements. Now, let's say we're using the wrong tools. Let's say, well, okay, I think what we should do here to make this process go faster is buy Salesforce. That's a very common thing you hear people say. I'm not picking on Salesforce, might be the solution, but it equally well might not be. So we take the view that we're going to do that. That sounds plausible. We spend 6 months implementing it. We spend lots of money putting it in place, training our staff, and then we find that the process is just as slow as it was when we started this whole thing, because it wasn't the problem. It was plausible, but it wasn't the problem, and we do that all the time in business. So we've got to find a better way. And here's a first sort of bicycle of the mind, if you like. Imagine this is a set of pipes with water flowing through them, and water is flowing from the top left of the diagram to the bottom right, and all the pipes are different thicknesses. Now, each of these pipes corresponds to a stage in one of your processes. So the thicker the pipe, the faster that stage in the process goes. So that's the analogy we're looking at here. Now, if I was to ask someone which one of these pipes governs the rate of flow through this whole system, then I think most of us, without much hesitation, would say, well, it's the thinnest pipe there, because it doesn't matter how big the other pipes are. If that pipe's thin, then water only goes through at a certain rate, and that's absolutely true. And of course, therefore, if I said to you, well, I think what we should be doing though is the pipe at the start, we should make that much wider, because I think that would help the flow. Of course, you'd know that was a silly thing to do. You wouldn't work in pipes before the bottleneck or after the bottleneck, but in business, we do that all the time, because we don't think about this very simple concept. I've seen so many examples where, for example, you've got a product engineering team, and the rate of the overall feature development is governed by the fact there's not enough engineers, or there's some inefficiency in engineering. The product team is still hiring product managers, and the product team is still coming up with new ideas, and they're presenting those to the team and so on. It's not making any positive difference to the rate of feature development, but they've just made the pipe wider there and everyone feels good about it. Or in Skyscanner, I remember when our product was about basically having lots of airlines and travel agencies connected to our system. We had when I was there, we had about 1,400. I'm sure it's more now. And we got into a situation where to integrate these airlines and so on took a long time. It was quite difficult to do for a bunch of reasons, but we were still bonusing the sales team on signing up more airlines, even although we couldn't implement them. And what we'd done is make that pipe much wider there, and we were incentivizing people to do unnecessary plumbing. But if you think about the beauty of this idea, it's basically in any flow-based system, be it a river, pipes, or any of your processes, at any point in time, there's only one constraint, just one, not 7, not 5 bottlenecks we're going to go and work on, just one. And that's a very powerful concept, because if you know there's just one thing to find, that's much easier to deal with cognitively than if there's like 25 problems. We can always find one thing, can't we? We can't fix 10, but I can fix one. Now, obviously, when you fix that pipe and make it wider, there'll be a new bottleneck, but now you're going faster, and you can just repeat that process as much as you like. So this comes from a person called Eli Goldratt, who developed a theory of constraints. And it's a very simple but powerful set of techniques. I'll mention a few books at the end that I'd really urge you to read. But it's a very, very powerful mechanism, and it dramatically, our realization in Skyscanner, for example, that every process had just one constraint, just one bottleneck, was profoundly liberating in terms of our productivity. We dramatically transformed the speed of which our processes ran. So how did we do that? Well, this is what you do. It's a very simple process at its highest level. You start off with the conviction that in this complex process, there's just one constraint. You find it, and you repeat that process until you get the speed that you want, and as long as your resources allow you to do that. As opposed to saying, maybe we should fire those people, and we should get Salesforce, and we should go and work in 7 bottlenecks and all this kind of stuff, which is what we normally say. So slight complication is that if this was a physical manufacturing production line, you would know where the bottleneck was, because you could see where the parts that are unfinished would be piling up in front of one of the machines, one of the stages. But most of us nowadays, and it depends on the country you're in, tend to work in more abstract environments. Like I'm from a software engineering background. We didn't have a factory floor. we had, like tools that recorded bugs and where they were and had they been fixed. And it was nothing to stand in a gantry and see the bottleneck. So how do you find the bottleneck? Well, it's a very high-tech solution. You basically get Post-its and you dedicate a wall of one of your rooms. And you can do this virtually, of course, with the tools we have as well. And you basically map the process. You turn your abstract process into a factory floor made of Post-its. And the one you can see here is a few examples, obviously, from Skyscanner times, but the one along the top there was our billing reconciliation process. End of every month, we had to go to those 1,400 airlines and travel agents and agree whether or not we'd given as much business as we thought we had. And this was the process. Now, the reason we had that on the wall is because it slowed down catastrophically and we couldn't close the month, or we're in danger of not being able to close the month, which is a problem. When we asked people, how does this work? Nobody knew, because over the 10 years before that, it'd been added to, evolved, things not taken out. Nobody knew the whole process. So what we simply did was get four or five people in a room who knew bits of it, not the most senior people, by the way, the people who knew the process, and we mapped it out and then we simulated things moving through it. And we just studied where are they getting stuck and where is the constraint. And although that's very complicated looking, knowing that there was only one problem that was currently gating at speed is extremely energizing, for a team. If you're going into something that you know is too hard, you don't do a good job. If you know it's solvable, you feel much more energetic. So, but essentially how you do this and how I recommend you do it is you start off by assigning someone senior in your business to own this task, because they'll give the air cover to make the changes that you need. So I was a COO, so that's an example, because it's not a popular process to kind of start to change how processes work. And then you take, a sort of cross-section of people who know the process or bits of the process, and then you make it their job for the next 4 to 6 weeks to intensively go through that iteration process. And to put more detail into that iteration process, this is kind of how it looks. You start off with, you map the process, and that takes about 3 to 4 days sometimes. And then you simulate an item moving through the process. So for example, a bug or a feature or a string translation, to go back to my opening example. And then you see where it gets stuck. And then you go through a process of what's called subordinate, exploit, and elevate, which I'll talk about in a second. And you just keep doing that until you get the speed that you want. Now, what do I mean by subordinate, exploit, and elevate? Well, let's look at that. Let's start with the word subordinate. I gave an example earlier where even although the process that we had was gated on, say, engineering capacity, people were still putting more stuff into the process. And what you do, once you find your bottleneck, this is a difficult thing to accept and embrace, but you slow down the rest of the stages in the process to match that speed. Why do you do that? Well, let's imagine this was a physical production line, and stage B of the production line is going half the speed of stage A and stage C. So pretty quickly, stage B is going to have a whole bunch of piled up parts that can't be processed. If that was soft fruit and it was a perishable product, they'd go off. If it was computer hardware, they'd become obsolete before you actually use them, and so on. So in a physical production line, they never run any upstream stage or downstream stage faster than the bottleneck, because it isn't just a neutral effect, it actually slows down and creates waste. Now let's think about a human process. Let's go back to my example of those product managers come up with new features while the engineers can't implement them. What does that do? Well, first of all, what they do is they say, well, every month we've got to meet with the CEO and talk through the product list. I need to scope these. So I'm going to come to an engineer and ask if you can help me scope how long these will take. So you're actually taking me out of the bottleneck, making it even slower to do busy work that doesn't help the overall process. That's a very, very common issue. So the other thing that we often forget is that people aren't machines in a production line. So the more work that piles up that I've got to do, the more depressed I feel. I'm never going to get through this. So if you run the process, we had a situation at one point in Skyscanner where we had 100 integrations we hadn't integrated, and the team responsible for integrating them felt like they were rolling, this Sisyphean task of rolling a ball uphill and it rolls back down again. We were demoralizing them while the sales team was getting bonuses for making the queue bigger. So you need to slow other people down or slow the system down to match the speed of the bottleneck first. Otherwise, you're actually slowing things down more and more. That also frees up some people that can potentially help you in the next stage, exploiting the bottleneck. So before you've come to a solution about how to make this go faster, how do you get the most out of that existing reality? What would be an example of that in manufacturing? It would be, let's make sure that that machine that's running the slowest, that we don't leave it idle during lunchtime. Let's stagger our lunch breaks. That's a simple example. In human terms, let's say that we've got 3 engineers in the team. Let's not keep pulling them away from what they're doing to go and have status meetings or to attend, an offsite or all those things, or to ask them to come and help scope things for a meeting so I'll look good, those kind of things. Let's leave them alone, be one way of doing it. You could also take those product managers who are no longer, come up with features and get them to help out by testing some stuff. There's ways you can exploit the bottleneck. And then finally, elevating is simply where you make a permanent fix to the problem. Maybe you hire more people, you rearrange the team so there's more capacity in that space or something like that. But the goal here is to keep doing this, subordinate to the bottleneck, don't overload it. Find a way of getting maximum capacity from it while you're thinking about it, and then find a solution. And once you've done that, you'll find the bottleneck's now somewhere else. You take a view, do I need to make this process go faster? If you do, you just repeat this process. And it's very, very, very powerful. And just give one sort of hint as to what you often find. So this process here, what we found with the string translation example I mentioned with Fang at the start of our session today, when we analysed that, the 6 weeks consisted of, she raised the bug, it sat somewhere for 2 weeks because people were doing other things and didn't look at it. Eventually someone would look at it and assign it to a sub-team. And then that team was busy finishing its own work, so it'd sit for another week. They would then come and look at it and say, I can't reproduce that problem. Could you try again for me? So it'd go back to the raiser for a week, and then they'd be busy and so on. So the amount of time we spent touching that problem was maybe a few hours, but it took 6 weeks because it was mainly wait time. And very often that's a problem in your business. You've got stuff lying around that people aren't touching, and the end-to-end process time becomes very, very bad. So a very simple solution is to just look for wait time. So that's just one example. There's many others, but give you a flavor of it. So that's the first thing, throughput problems and how to address them. There is only one constraint in any flow-based system. It's a very simple but profound bicycle of the mind that can transform your ability to solve process problems. The second one we're going to look at now before we go to our break is conflicting imperatives, 2 equally important sub-goals that somehow clash with each other. So let's look at some examples of that. So here's a real example from Skyscanner again. And this is a situation where we were trying to get to that iteration speed issue I was talking about. We want to be as fast as we can. We want to learn as quickly as possible. So to build a product our customers love, person on the left says, we need to iterate quickly. Yeah, we all agree. And we need to release software almost every day so we can iterate quickly. We try something, we release it, we see what customers do. Based on that feedback, we change it, we do it again. And that's how we'll get to fast iteration, which is true. That's absolutely a true statement. Now, on the other hand, the test team's view was to build a product that's loved by customers, it needs to be reliable, of course. And that means we need to thoroughly test it. That's also true. The problem is those things are in apparent contradiction to each other, and people had a big fight about it. This was a conflict in the business for a number of weeks, even months. We hadn't got good at that point in resolving conflicts by the methods we're going to talk about. So people just fought with each other about it in a polite way. So we've already looked at this. In any flow-based system, there's only one constraint. Let's add now another kind of useful kind of thinking point, which is in any closed system, this is another theory of constraints point. In any closed system, there are no conflicts, only incorrect assumptions. Now let's think about that. Any non-personal conflict that you have in your business about how to approach something is actually not a conflict. It's someone's made a wrong assumption. Systems are integral, and someone's made a wrong assumption about something. There is no conflict. That's what this says. Now let's test that. I'm going to say up front that I can't prove if that's mathematically true, but I can say that if you believe it, you'll get an awful lot further in practice than if you don't believe it. So let's investigate that. So go back to our example. To build a product our customers love, we've got to test and iterate quickly, and we've got to test extensively to have a high quality product that our customers love. Let's map that out in what's now called a conflict cloud. So we start with the goal, a product our customers love, and then let's follow opinion A here. Well, to do that, we need to have a very fast build, measure, learn cycle, iterate quickly. So that requires us to release software every day. So fair enough. Meanwhile, team B says that for that, we need a highly reliable product. I'm just restating the sentence visually. And for that, we need to test extensively. Now, that's all true as well. This is where the conflict arises, that these two statements are in conflict because the test team's view was, if you release software every day, of course you can't test extensively. We take a week minimum to test the software thoroughly. So, we can't do that. Now, if you follow this idea that there are no conflicts, only incorrect assumptions, which of these assumptions is wrong? And of course, nowadays in software engineering, this is standard. This isn't a conflict, but back 10 years ago, it was a debate and a conflict. And the answer is that there's an incorrect assumption here that you can't test extensively and also release every day. And the answer is to automate your testing, like heavily invest in automating all of it. And that's what we did. So we automated everything, pretty much everything, so that we ended up in a situation where you'd write some software, put it onto the bus, it'd be automatically tested. And then once it was tested, it'd be automatically put out to a fraction of our customers to see what they made of it. If it passed that test, it could be released into production. And that meant that our test team changed its shape, it became smaller, we assigned people to other jobs, and we hit that goal. And although that seems a very simple example, laying them out like that and saying, let's assume that there's an incorrect assumption here is profoundly helpful when you're trying to resolve conflicts. It's also very useful because conflicts start off as neutral and very quickly they become personal. The problem is that these guys are idiots. They're just being obstinate. They don't get it. I'm sure we've all used these phrases. We've all had them used about us. But the problem is once you get into that state, it's very, very difficult to recover back to the fundamentals. Whereas putting something like this up on your whiteboard and saying, well, let's break this down, turns people away from each other towards the whiteboard where they can talk about the issue. And that in itself is extremely valuable. Just as the example I showed with the process flow is very similar because the process isn't working. We're under pressure, we're getting criticized from our executives, and it's because those guys in floor 2. When you put up the process on the whiteboard, you turn people away from each other towards the process, and people start working together on it. So having a model that is moved away from between you to somewhere else that you can both look at is extremely helpful in resolving conflicts. So that's this a generic sort of model. So we want objective A, we need B, which means we want D, we need C, which means we want D dash, and they're in conflict. Let's look at another example from another Skyscanner example. This was an issue between two marketing teams, and it became quite heated, really heated. Like people were falling out with each other. And the debate was that we wanted to write great content. So we like articles about travel so that people would think about Skyscanner the next time they travel. So we did a lot of that. And one team, the Facebook team's view was that we should put our content onto Facebook and have it read there inside Facebook, because we can use Facebook's very comprehensive metrics to see how it's performing. We can read articles about what it should be and all that. So fair enough. The other team was a general content team who wrote the content and wanted to know which channels the content performed best on, and they wanted to know that one piece of writing was better or worse than another piece of writing. So they wanted a way of comparing things that were kind of apples for apples. So that was the starting point. And the conflict was that we all wanted this. The first team wanted content that performs very well optimally on a given channel. So their view was that you had to have that content read in Facebook. The other team wanted content metrics so they could compare content, the article itself, regardless of channel. And therefore, it all had to be read on our website because we had some metrics on our website. Regardless of where you came in, you'd read it on our website, we could see how that article compared to that article. And it became a big fight. And the conflict, sorry, there you go. The conflict was simply the assumption that you couldn't compare content unless it was read on our site. It's quite a simple example. The way you do that, of course, is you just find out a way of mapping Facebook metrics to what we thought was important and mapping other metrics to what we thought was important. So it's a simple issue, but because we'd never laid it out in terms of what's the incorrect assumption here, it became deeply personal. Those guys don't get it. They're just doing that to be obstinate. So laying out problems, big and small, or where you've got a conflict in your business is extremely helpful to just diffusing it and making it a neutral conversation about, is there an incorrect assumption in here? So this is a very powerful thought for your life. In any closed system, i.e. your business, there are no conflicts, only incorrect assumptions. Again, whether or not that's theoretically true, and we're in a university, I'm sure the mathematics people could tell us, it doesn't matter. In practice, it takes you an awful lot further than if you don't believe this. So that's what's to be remembered here. So we've looked at these two areas here, decision bottlenecks, and sorry, we haven't looked at these two. We're going to look at these two areas next. We're going to look at why do we bottleneck on decisions even though we know we shouldn't, and how do we avoid that? And we're going to look at path dependence. We know things suck, but we're just going to keep doing them anyway, and we all march towards the edge of the cliff together. Exhibit A, global warming. Maybe we'll try and solve that at some point in this session today. But we're going to look at those two things after the break. So suggest we take a 15-minute break just now, and we'll be back for that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so welcome back, everyone. Let's see where we are. So before the break, we looked at a number of things. We looked at the anatomy of productivity problems, and we started to look at, excuse me, shouldn't have had that biscuit. We started to look at the static issues around that, and also the dynamic issues that affect productivity. Then we started to look into some solutions for some of those kind of fundamental and common issues. So we looked at these two areas before the break in terms of static issues. And in this final part today, we're going to look at these two, and we're also going to look at the dynamics and how to deal with the dynamics a little bit. So let's start with the one up here, path dependence. Now, this is the one that we just keep doing the same thing, even though we know it's wrong. And you will definitely fall into this as you grow your business for sure. And it's good to be aware of it and to start to understand what stops us taking the actions that objectively need to be taken. It's an interesting test. If you go into someone else's business and they say, what do you think? You can very quickly say, oh, you shouldn't do this and you should start doing this and so on. When it's your own business, it seems emotionally much harder because of all those sunk costs of the things you're already used to doing. So it's a good exercise actually to pretend you're a consultant. If we were arriving in this business today, assessing it, would we be doing what we're doing? Just stand back from the business and say, would we have designed the organization this way if we had 50 people, or did it just fall into this mess because we added one at a time? So it's important to do those kind of mental tests, but let's look at this subject a bit more deeply. So why do we suffer from productivity path dependence? Well, let's look at each very quickly. The first thing is that we believe that big problems have big solutions, and that puts us off. So we tend to look at small things we can fix because we're afraid of the big things. What if it was the case that big problems also could have small solutions? Well, how would things feel then? I'm going to suggest that we start believing that's true and see how far we get. So we're going to look at some real examples. We also get overwhelmed with symptoms. So lots of things are not working. That implies there's lots of problems. There might actually just be one problem with lots of symptoms. So again, I'm going to suggest that you start from that belief and see where it takes you, and it will take you further in practice than if you don't believe that. The next thing is we lack the analytical ability to solve those things. So even if we agree with the first 2 points, how do I go about parsing through all this? So because it seems too hard, we tend to just go and find other things to do. And also, if you've got a multi-team environment, agreeing on the same terminology or the same view of the problem is very difficult, because well, I think it's your fault and you think it's my team's fault. So that's a good start. So if you can find a way again to turn people away from each other into a common terminology, you get an awful lot further with these things. And finally, because all of the stuff I've just said is true, or seems to be true, I should say, we just do displacement work. The real problem is this, but it's easier to go and do this stuff, so I'll do that. So that's a very, very common issue. So a Skyscanner example at one point would have been that our marketing people really needed to be able to access the deep data from our system to write really impactful travel stuff about, most popular routes and all this kind of stuff. Because the engineers were too busy and they wouldn't talk to them and they wouldn't find a way to work together, they just wrote sort of other articles that weren't that strong for a while because they couldn't access the data because the problem is too hard to solve. So it's always easier to just do displacement work. So we tend to do that because, as I said earlier, in evolutionary terms, we don't like effort, mental effort. It's too tiring, it uses too much energy. So let's start with another one of those useful things to remember. And I'm going to suggest that you really inculcate this one, which is one cause leads to many problems, not the other way round. We tend to think of this as just so many things we can't deal with all of them. But what if underlying all your problems there was only like one or two causes and you could solve those? How do we arrive at that truth? How do we discover if that's the case? So that's what we're going to look at here. And we're going to look at it by using a method called current reality trees. And we're going to start with these things which are undesirable effects. So don't worry too much about the definition. The undesirable effects are the current symptoms in your business, things that are causing trouble. And we don't want those, obviously, but we've got them. So these are examples of undesirable effects. Employee morale is low, for example. That's an undesirable effect. We're decreasing our profits, attrition's increasing, we're not hiring fast enough. Now, I have been in meetings where people are saying all those things. I'm sure you've heard those things before. So we've got a lot of problems here. So we're never able to solve all of those, so let's not bother trying. That's what happens. But what if they're all caused by the same thing, for example? That might be a different story. But these are examples of undesirable effects. Now, let's now take those and map them into a structure that allows us to parse these problems. Very simple structure. Here's our undesirable effects as before. And they have causes, and they've different causes. So let's imagine those white boxes are the causes. But those causes in turn have causes, so the causes of the causes. And we can call those intermediate effects. And finally, those intermediate causes have root causes. And it's the root causes that we need to be able to get to, because that's where we can take action. And if we can address the root causes, all the intermediate effects will flip into positive things, which in turn will flip the symptoms that we can most easily see. So there's a powerful thought there that you don't have to solve all of these issues, you just have to solve the root causes and the other ones will flip. So this starts to become a wranglable, tractable problem. So let's take an example. Just get through there. I don't like this example very much, but it's the example that's often used. I'm going to give you a real example from a real business in a minute, but this in a very simple way illustrates the issue, but don't take it too seriously. So the first is that we've got a car and the car's got some problems. The car's engine won't start, the air conditioning is not working and the radio is not working. So we've got some problems. So let's see if we can use this methodology. Well, as we do some analysis, we find out that for the first issue, the engine obviously needs fuel to run, but fuel's not getting to the engine. So because there's fuel not getting to the engine, the car's engine won't start. Because air is not able to circulate in air conditioning, it's not working. And because the speakers are obstructed, the radio sounds distorted. So you see how I'm reading this, I'm saying because of this, this is the cause. So we're going to keep that up. So let's go a bit further down. So why is fuel not getting to the engine? Because there's water in the fuel line, fuel's not getting to the engine, which means the car's engine won't start. Because the air intake's full of water, air is not able to circulate, etc. And because the speakers have water in them, the speakers are obstructed, so the sound's distorted. So we're reading them backwards. And the reason for that is the car's in the swimming pool. Now, you can go further. You can say, why is the car in the swimming pool? The handbrake stops the car from rolling, but the handbrake's faulty. So one root cause here caused all these problems. And the idea, of course, is if you remove those issues, then all these other things go away. So it's a bit of a silly example, but it illustrates the model. So let's let's look at how we can change that reality and then apply it to an actual real example. And as another Skyscanner example, not to pick on that company. First of all, we need to look at this thing called injections. So can we inject into that current reality something that changes it to be a better future reality? And that's how you address the root causes. So let's see if we can do that. So what you basically do is put your injections in, it causes everything to flip positive and job done. Sounds easy, but it does work. It really does work. So the key message from here before we look at an example of that is that if we can turn the root causes positive, everything else flips positive too. And that's profoundly important because it's a tractable problem then. So it's the essence of big problems don't necessarily need massive solutions. Sometimes a small set of relatively simple injections can dramatically change a negative reality into something more positive. So I'm going to give you an example of that. This is a real example from one of my experiences. And this was an example where our marketing team was quite a large team, and there was a number of issues in the air at the time regarding budgets. And these were just some of the kind of headline items that were causing some problems. The first is that although we had a budget, and although we wanted to spend the budget, marketeers wanted to do their jobs, and the currency of marketing in that sense is often having money to place ads and so on and so forth. We're still just spending 50% of our budget every month. Now that created pressure to reduce the budget, but if you reduce the budget, we still just spent 50% of it. So that wasn't the solution. So what was going on there? Second issue is that in a team with lots of very creative, energetic, dynamic people from all over the world, we were seeing that people were stopping submitting ideas, which is, obviously not what you want, and it was at odds with the inherent creativity of those people. And also we found that people were very frustrated about the whole budgeting issue and falling out with each other about it. So once more, a system issue starts to manifest as a people issue. And so if you ever see a people issue, it's often worth asking what is the underlying system issue that's causing that. And also we had forward planning on campaigns was really poor. You couldn't get people to forward plan for the next 1 to 3 months. It was all very kind of reactionary. So you could have looked at it and said, this team's no good, or this is all just too hard and all that kind of stuff. But we really did apply a current reality tree to this. And this is the journey we went on. So there's the 4 points I've just made now expressed in a current reality tree. And starting to kind of question, well, why is this? So just like, why is it that we only spend 50%? What came out was that, first of all, teams didn't know how much they could spend. Now, if a team doesn't know how much it can spend, then it's going to be careful not to overspend. So the budget was getting underspent because of that. And people weren't submitting ideas that required budget because they were worried about going over the spend limit, and that was a problem for them. So let's move down a bit further and we start to expose a few more intermediate effects now. So following that same example, it took a long time for budget approval. If I had an idea, it took a few weeks to get budget approval for it. Now, the trouble is that in that intervening period, I didn't know if I was going to get that money. So I didn't know how much I could spend on other programs. So that was throttling things. So because it took too long to approve the budget, and the budget reconciliation to tell us if we were on track had a big lag, teams didn't know how much they could spend, so they didn't spend the budget. So we're getting somewhere. Over on the other side of things, because the teams who did the work didn't have visibility of the budget, they also didn't know. So even if these lags had existed, they didn't have visibility of the budget. If they had visibility, they could have maybe made some guesses, but they didn't have visibility. And that also caused them to be frustrated because they wanted more control, because people want to have agency to do their jobs. And forward planning was poor because they didn't really know how big the budget was. So when you write these things down, it all looks like super simple, but at the start, it all seems intractable. And I've often found when you write it down like this, it's embarrassingly simple, and you think, well, why did we do that? So let's keep going. So going further, it turns out that because the chief marketing officer was overloaded, he was awfully busy, and he took too long to approve budgets. He didn't reconcile the budget in time, so and so on up. So that was starting to get a tangible issue here. Let's go a bit further down. why was the CMO overloaded? Well, partly because he held the budget centrally and he held it only in his laptop, and partly because he expected every spend over £100 to be approved. So that meant there was lots of requests going in, and you had to process all this and so on and so forth. So we've arrived at a root causes, you might say. You could actually go one level further down and say, well, the real issue was too much executive control. And it's a very common issue that when people go from being a team leader or a manager where you're expected to control these things and be right on the money to more senior positions, they take with them the practices of being a team leader rather than being a director. And I always say that when you get promoted or take on a new job, half of what you used to do you bring with you, and the other half of what made you successful, you have to dump it. And that's painful, and we often don't. We bring it with us. In this case, I'm bringing with me the behaviors of a team leader into an executive position, and it's not working. So it created these issues. Now, to address those issues, of course, it's relatively simple. We've got some injections to make, and injections we made were these. So first of all, we distributed the budget. Secondly, we put in a proper budgeting tool, so it wasn't on someone's laptop, it could be seen everywhere. And thirdly, we changed the approval limit to something higher. And if you follow that through, because the budget's distributed and there's a proper tool and the budgeting limits are higher, the CMO is no longer overloaded, so that's flipped. It doesn't take so long to do budget approvals. Reconciliation is much faster, which means that teams do know how much they can spend, which means that we spend more of the budget, and so on and so forth. So all those white issues flip when you do those three relatively small things. And I don't know if that's the most profound example you'll ever see, but it's a real example, so I wanted to use it. But I can't emphasize how much of an issue this felt for the people in the room at the time until we just started to work it through. And if you arrive with a team that you don't really know how it works or what they do, like I wasn't a marketing expert, but you can ask these questions and draw these charts and turn people away from each other towards the diagram. It's amazing. They have the solutions in their heads. It's just giving them a framework to articulate it. So it's amazingly powerful. Now, the problem with injections is they sometimes create new issues. And a very common pathology is you say something like, why can't we do this? And people say, oh, if you did that, you'd have this problem, so you can't do it. And then we stop there, And the trouble is that therefore you never get anywhere. But what you have to do is say, if I do this, it creates a new problem, but is this new problem easier to solve than the one we started with? And if the answer is yes, then you do that thing. If the answer is no, then it's not helpful. But you don't stop as soon as you've created a new problem, which a lot of people do. So it kind of looks like this diagrammatically. The new injection creates a new undesirable effect, but we can put a new injection in for that undesirable effect that we just created, and that one is easier to solve. Therefore, it's progress. So for example, in my example, we had to buy a budgeting tool and that cost money, so we should stop. Or should we buy it because it's an easier problem to solve than having all this grief and wasted time, human effort. So that's current reality trees. And one cause leads to many problems is a very useful thing to remember. So you find yourself got a lot of problems in life or in business, then try just believing this and then try mapping it like this. It's not a hard thing to do. And it can be very, very helpful for you and everybody to anatomize and understand the problem and turn us all away from blaming each other. So, sometimes it is someone's fault. I'm not saying that that's never true. Sometimes it is someone's fault, but don't start there. Start from a system problem, and you might end up there or you might not. So the other point that we can take from this one is that big problems require small solutions. So we had big problems there. We couldn't spend money. People were really frustrated and upset. We couldn't forward plan, but we had just a small set of things to do to make that all much, much better. So believing this means that you tackle issues you otherwise wouldn't bother tackling because they're too big, and I'll go and do displacement work instead. So that's what we're trying to avoid. Okay, so that's path dependence. Let's now go to decision bottlenecks. And this is the issue that we're always gated on one one or two people even though we've hired lots of other people. Now let's look at the anatomy of that. We're going to start by doing a little time travel journey. Imagine that we're standing, for people who are here today, we're standing in this same spot, but it's maybe like 1,000 years ago. And it looks a bit like this, except the trees aren't as pointy. And one day, so it's basically undeveloped land, let's call it that. And then one day someone comes along and thinks, well, I could live here and I could make a living here. So they unload their cart and they tie up their horse and they build a little house. And it's not a great house because I had to build it with just my own hands and with my horse's help. And here we are. And then I start growing crops and things like that. And I try and eke out a subsistence living now. This is how very, very many people lived not that long ago. And the problem is that because it's just me, I can't have cattle, for example, because when I have to go to market, as I have to do quite often to get supplies, someone will come and steal my cattle or wolves will eat them or something like that. If I get sick, then I can't generate calories in the field and can't harvest my grain. So I'm going to die if I get sick. So it's a really, really difficult life for that person. And then one day someone else comes along and sees their settlement, their house, and decides to set up right next door. So now there's two people. So what does that do when there's two people? Well, two people are far more productive than per person than one person, because now the two of us can build each other a house, and two hands are much more powerful. Two sets of hands are much more powerful than one set. In that regard, one of us can look after the cattle while one of us goes to market. So now we've got higher calorie foodstuffs. We can generate more economic output. If one of us is sick, the other one can cover for us, so we don't have those risks. So it's just a much stronger group now, or settlement now. There's just two people in it, and that trend continues. Let's say some more people arrive. Now enough people have arrived that we can open a blacksmith shop and a grocery shop. So now we don't have to go to market anymore because we can just pop down to the local grocery store. So that saves us lots of time. We're much more productive again. And what's happening here is that we're getting more and more productive per person, not just as a group, but per person as we add more people into this human settlement. Eventually we get like this. We've got schools, so you don't have to teach your children anymore. You can keep working while they're taught by someone else, and so on and so forth. We just become mechanized and automated and so on and so forth. So productivity just keeps going up. And it looks a bit like this. And it's very profound, the idea that 10 people are far more productive per person than one person in a human settlement, and 100 people are far more productive per person than 10 people. It's a very profound concept, especially when you consider the equivalent in company terms. But before we look at that, let's just consider this point. There's a square meter of land. Now, the square meter of land I'm on today, 1,000 years ago was worth nothing, like literally worth nothing. And now this square meter of land, if I tried to sell it, would be worth quite a lot of money. If this was the city of London and I was right in the middle of it, then it would be worth millions of pounds maybe for a square meter of land. Not because I can start mining for copper on it or something like that, because of its collaboration value, because that's where people collaborate. And that's quite, you think about something at no value now has lots of value because of its ability to be collaborative. But if you go into the company model, we find something very, very different. When we hire more people, we tend to find that although a company ostensibly is a lot like a human settlement, it's a society and there's people doing different things, productivity per person usually falls in a company, even as it rises in a city. And I think if we can understand why that is, we've got a long way to understanding some of the dynamics that we were talking about earlier. So let's look into that a little bit. And let's do that by looking at two employees, employee 4 and employee 204. What's their experiences? So employee 4 is either one of the co-founders of the business or is employee number 1 after the 3 founders or something like that. So what does she experience? Well, first of all, she really knows the strategy because she probably thought it up, or she worked with people who did, or she sits next to people who do. She knows what decisions she can make. Maybe she's the VP of engineering or the VP of product. So, she in a small company, she basically is the person who makes all the decisions about engineering, for example. She is very well aligned with her team, and she understands the market and so on and so forth. She's get very high agency to act. In other words, very, very high agency. Let's give her an agency index of 100, just as a kind of concept, and you can use that to compare her to employee 204, who joins after the company's grown significantly. Now, what's her experience? Well, she does not understand the strategy because the day she arrived, all the leaders of the business are busy now fighting fires. So someone from HR gave her a slide pack that was 6 months old and said, the strategy's in there. So she's kind of like, not really sure what we do around here. So that's a problem. She's been hired to be the new customer service manager, but she heard that Jeff over in the other building thinks he might own a bit of that process as well. So she's not really sure what she owns. So she can't really get on with stuff. And she's not really sure where to go for decisions about stuff that she doesn't own because no one's explained it to her, and so on. So her agency is quite low. Her index might be 25 instead of 100. And that's the essence of why productivity starts to drop, I think, when we grow a business. So it looks a bit like this, and it's not just the new employees that are affected, because employee 4's productivity will drop as well because employee 204 has arrived. Why is that? Because if I don't have agency, I'll need to go and seek agency from someone else. And that results in the people at the center of the business starting to become more and more overloaded, so they can't do their jobs. So everybody's productivity index drops as you add people, unless you take extreme measures, or not extreme, but measures, let's call them. Now let's look at some of those. And the way I think about this problem is when you're growing your organization, the thing you always want to optimize for first is agency in your team. We often think about, if you're designing a car, what are you optimizing for? Well, if it's a sports car, you're optimizing for speed, let's say. If it's a people carrier, you're optimizing for luggage capacity. When you're growing your organization, people don't ask themselves, what are we optimizing for here? They just add bits to it. And the answer is you're optimizing for agency of your frontline people, so they can be as productive as the early employees were. That's a super important concept. So let's look at that a bit more. What do I mean by agency? Well, I mean 4 things. First of all, am I sufficiently competent? Now, I don't mean that pejoratively. Competence goes off unless tended to. It's like cheese. So for example, as a business grows, you add more people or the customer base gets bigger. If I and you don't invest in my competence, it just drops because the environment's changing and my competence isn't. So for example, I used an illustration earlier that if I'm a great manager of 3 people, that doesn't mean I'm a great manager of 10 people or 20. I might be really bad at that. And if you just assumed I'd still be good, then, that's why I'm not competent anymore, for example. So that's just the kind of essence of why people's competence drops. So if you want to keep your organization with high agency, you have to invest heavily in the competence of your people. I don't necessarily mean with money, although that's maybe part of it. I also mean with time and access to training materials and space and discussions about development. These aren't just things you do to keep employees engaged. They're critical to agency. If my competence drops, I can't have agency, therefore I have to seek it somewhere else. Therefore, you shouldn't have hired me in the first place. That's the issue. Let's now look at the second thing. My ownership is clear. Now, how to illustrate that? Well, let's imagine that Nuran and I are going to start a university book club or a book club in Glasgow. And we say, do you want to start a book club? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea. Tuesday nights? Yeah, Tuesday nights. Let's do that. So we start it. If we find there's another book club in town, we might merge with them or ignore them or something. But we just start the book club. We don't go to the government, we don't go to the Prime Minister and say, is it okay if we start a book club in Glasgow? But in companies, we do that all the time. I mean, literally we do. Employees will come to the founder and say, can we start a book club in this company? And what books do you think we should read? And stuff like that. Or worse, they'll go to the HR team and ask what they think about it. And this is an issue that we often keep ownership in the wrong place, and it takes away agency. So let's look at that a bit more mathematically, if you like. Here's a business, and the black dot in the center is the business when it started. So if you've got a one-person business today, that's you. And the front line of their business is that edge of that black circle. So all the decisions are made in the center of that black circle, that's you. And the edge of it is where the work gets done, that's also you. So the decision latency is 0. I need a decision, I've made it, right? That's the optimum state. Then you start to grow the company. And in growing the company, you add layers to this circle. And the problem is if you don't move that decision-making ownership out at the same speed, you start to introduce latency into the decision process. So let's take an extreme case where I'm out on that outer edge and I need a decision, but the founder still makes all the decisions. A very, very common pathology. No one means to do this, or maybe they do, but it's a very, very common issue. So that means that the latency is really long now, and that has consequences. First of all, it takes ages to get decisions. Secondly, eventually, because these are human beings, they eventually get a bit annoyed about that and stop having ideas. What's the point? You never get a decision out of these people. And thirdly, the center becomes overloaded, and your managers have got 100 things to do, and they get too many emails and all that stuff. And it's basically because of this decision latency pathology. Now, let's look at how bad that really is for a business. If we take a slightly more realistic view of a business, it's really like a surface, a decision surface. This green outer sphere here is a decision surface, and businesses need to make decisions rapidly to iterate quickly. So what effect does it have if all our decisions are going centrally into the center of the sphere? Well, it looks a bit like this. And you can see how that overloading of the people who are running the business is working there. There's no way they'll service those things. So this isn't a linear decline, it's worse than that. But also it means there's a maximum intensity of decisions that can be made in that surface. And the mathematics of it is such that basically the decision intensity drops as the square of that latency. Now that's profound. That means your ability to be making decisions at the front line of the business is catastrophically declining the more those decisions are held centrally. And that's a major issue to productivity. So if you want to have high agency, and you do, then you've got to have high decision intensity, and you've got to push decisions out to the front line. You can only push decisions out to the front line if the front line is competent, as we discussed earlier. And you can be autonomous. People talk about, I want autonomy, but it's possible to be autonomous and incompetent, and many people are. You've got to be autonomous and competent to have agency, and only then can you really push the decision making out. And that's why businesses, before you even start growing, you've got to have a view on this. How am I going to make sure that people are as productive as I am when I hire them? And how do I make sure they're competent enough? And how do I make sure that we're moving decision making out in a controlled fashion? There's different solutions to that, but you've got to be aware of those things. The third one is I'm appropriately aligned. Now, what does this mean? Well, if I've no idea what this business does, I can't make good decisions. I can't have agency. I thought we were selling, like soft drinks, but it turns out we're selling PPE, for example. That's probably a real example. And the other side of this coin is that it's also possible to have too much alignment. And this is another one of these issues that many founders fall into. They insist on too much alignment. I need to approve everything. You got to present everything to me. I've got to know everything that's going on in this business. And we had this problem in Skyscanner. I remember one occasion where we had decided to introduce objectives into the business, like clear objectives. So we had company objectives, and everyone knew what we're trying to do. So that was great. So we went up this graph. We moved from 0 to a bit further along, and our net benefit went up. And then we said, wouldn't it be good if all the major teams had objectives that aligned with those objectives? So we moved a bit further up. It's great. Then we said, wouldn't it be good if the sub-teams aligned with the major teams that they're in, to turn aligned with the company? That was great. We're continuing to move up and get benefit from this alignment. And then someone said, wouldn't it be good if every quarter we had a session where every team presents its objectives to the senior people so we can make sure we're aligned? And that sounds like a good thing to do. But of course, that requires slides, and it requires presentations, and it requires practice of those presentations, because I'm not going to make a fool of myself in front of the CEO. And then it requires a bit of, what are those guys over there doing? Are their slides better than mine? So it's a bit of an arms race on slides. But let's have the nicest graphs and all that kind of stuff. Then someone said, this is a great process. Why don't we do the same thing at the end of the quarter to see if we did this stuff? That's more slides, that's more stuff. Then someone said, this is a lot of stuff. Why don't we hire somebody to run this process? So we hired somebody to run the process. And that person thought, well, this is my job. I need to make it a full-time job. So they started inventing new tools. So for example, every day, team leaders could enter their progress against their objectives. So we could have a complete dashboard at top level. And then for some strange reason, their productivity tanked. And it eventually became very clear we'd started to go past the optimum point and fall over the other side, where running the bureaucracy became the goal of the teams, not the stuff that the bureaucracy was supposed to be reporting about. And again, it sounds all very silly in hindsight, but when you're actually flying that plane, it's not so obvious. So I would urge you to have a sense of not too little alignment and not too much. Give people wiggle room to live and be creative, and they'll make mistakes. You've got to think about these things. So too much alignment is also bad for agency, is the point there. And then finally, I have the necessary resources. What does that mean? Well, of course, the first thing I think is we need to hire more people. That's what that means. That's not what I mean. Often we have the necessary resources, but we conspire to make sure that they can't play with each other. How do we do that? Well, here's a classic example from a software company. What the marketing person thinks that their job is to generate traffic. The product management people think what we do is we create feature lists, and engineers, what do? They build features. So we're all happy. The trouble is nature doesn't work that way. It doesn't respect our convenient functional boundaries. So for example, if you want to onboard, if you want to get customers for your business, it's a bit like this. You've got to acquire them, you've got to get them interested. You've got to activate them into a habit. I buy your product every month, or I visit your website or use your app every day. So you've got to activate them into that habit. They don't have that habit just because they come once. And then you've got to keep them in that habit. And while they're in that habit, you've got to monetize them, and you've got to encourage them to tell their friends about your product so that they will in turn bring new people through this process. Now that cuts across all those boundaries we just looked at. It requires engineers and marketeers and product people to work together. But if you've got these very strict, we do this and only this, then you undermine this process. You don't let nature work. And therefore, I don't have access to the necessary resources to do the job. Therefore, my agency is reduced. We need a designer to get this software released, but the design team's got a 3-week backlog. I've lost all my agency. I can't release my software. Very common problem. You have to think about designing around multiple networks in your business. The functional hierarchy everybody loves because that's where we get status. I'm the grand high wizard of engineering, for example, and as my business card. But we've also got to have a way of addressing tasks, things we're actually trying to do. And that requires teams to come together into non-functionally homogeneous groups. There's different ways you can do that. And neither of those things are good at innovation. That requires spontaneity. It requires those kind of, dare I say, water cooler conversations that people used to have. So you've got to find a way to make sure that people can still talk across boundaries, because all the great creativity that we admire in life is made up of multiple functional skills. So you've got to think about that in your business as it grows. Cue the music. It's a good ringtone. I felt uplifted there. I was expecting someone to appear from the sky. Squads is a model we use where, as a business got great, we restructured it into a set of small startups, essentially called squads. And each squad had these attributes. It was like a small startup. It could release its software independently of everybody else, didn't have to ask or coordinate. So we re-engineered our software so that was possible. It had its own mission. It was multidisciplinary, so it had all the skills needed to do the job, just like a startup would have, and so on. And it made us dramatically more productive because we pushed the agency out to the front line. Now, it didn't work for everybody. We put people to run these squads, and some of them failed because suddenly it exposed that they actually weren't able to lead a group. But it was profoundly productive when we got into that model. So there's different ways at different scales to do this. But the point is, you're trying to optimize for agency. I'll just skip that. And as you grow, you've got to be prepared to change everything to restore agency, because that's what you're optimizing for in an organization, and it will go away. And you've got to be willing to chase it down again and restore it. Now, how do you know that you've got an agency problem? This takes us back to our little inflection point graph from earlier. Let's say we're adding employees, and then one day you find this happens, agencies dropped through the floor, which happens because we've hit one of those inflection points I was talking about earlier. How do you know that's coming? The trouble is you can't use revenue, you can't use number of users, you can't use any of these things to tell you. These are all lagging indicators. They're the consequences of the problem. They're not the leading indicator of the problem. The one I used was this one, which is frustration levels. good people in your business get frustrated and upset when they can't do the stuff they used to be able to do. And they'll manifest that in lots of ways. Like they'll be impolite, they'll blame others, they'll not behave, or they'll stop talking to you, they'll withdraw from you. And you shouldn't treat that as, oh, what's that person's got a problem, I'm going to have to discipline them. There's an agency problem here, and this is the early harbinger of that. I need to pay a lot of attention to it. So how do you know what the frustration levels are? Well, you don't have a frustratometer that you can sort of, point at people, but what you can do is you can talk to people a lot. And if they get used to the senior person talking to them, they'll become less suspicious of you and eventually start being honest with you. And the day their behavior starts to change, along some lines I said, there's a frustration problem, there's an agency problem building up, and that's how you know. And then, of course, you'll change whatever you have to change along those 4 elements to restore that agency. So that is the nature of the dynamics of productivity. So monitor frustration to detect agency collapse. You can even monitor it yourself, and that's a good place to start. What's the reaction of your loved ones to your behavior recently? Is that because I've got an agency problem? So in summary, on agency, you need to invest in that individual competence, push decision ownership to the front line where you've put that competence, be appropriately aligned, but not overly or underly aligned, and remove the barriers to the necessary resources. They're probably already here, but just make sure you haven't erected barriers for functional convenience, because we all like to be in our little sandboxes and not interact with people who are different from us. So in its conclusion, how do you use this stuff? So let's look at that in the last few minutes. Well, the first thing I'd say is I'd urge you to read the classic process optimization texts. Now, that might sound a bit heavy, but it isn't. I'll explain why it's not heavy. So here are some of them. Now, the theory of constraints, which I talked about, and I showed you some examples from the idea that every process is only one constraint, is embodied in a book called The Goal in the top left there, and it's a novel. It's not actually a technical book. It's not going to win the Nobel Prize for Literature as a novel, but it's very readable. So it's basically, it follows the story of somebody who had this problem in a company, and it's a very readable book, and it's also at the same time very profound. And we made this required reading amongst senior people in the business. It was just reading this book and propagating it in our company transformed the productivity of the company at that time. So I'd highly recommend that book. And the one next to it is not luck, is the sequel. It's another novel. It's the sequel because Eli Goldratt realized that people prefer to read novels, we prefer stories. So it's very, very readable, but very, very profound. And of course, it's available in audiobooks. So I would highly, highly recommend everybody to look at those 2 books. Once that gets you interested, another great book is The Toyota Way. So how does the Toyota production system work? Really, really readable, really good book. Even if you read just some of it, it'll give you lots of great ideas how to think about it. And then these other 2 books, Rolling Rocks Downhill and The Phoenix Project, are also novels of sorts that are just basically applying some of the techniques from the first 2 books to other scenarios like software engineering, etc. But I'd urge you to try and read certainly at least the first book there as a starter and see how it feels. And I think it will profoundly change the way you think about productivity. It's not going to tell you are you in the right market and all that stuff. That's not what today's about. That's obviously very important. But today's about the subject of assuming you are and you've got the right product, more or less. How do you become productive? And these are profoundly valuable texts to read for that. The second thing is that these books aren't about your business, and they weren't about my business either. They're about things like manufacturing and so on. It's very powerful to assume that great ideas from other domains can be transferred to yours. So everything we've talked about today, you might say, well, that doesn't affect me. That might be true. If it isn't affecting you, it will be soon, or it already is. So I just try and accept that it is, and try and inculcate those simple ideas. There's only one constraint. There are no conflicts, only incorrect assumptions. Big problems have small solutions. If you only remember that and apply that when you're going about your business, you will find that you solve a lot more stuff than if you didn't believe it. So therefore, it's practically valuable for founders and startups. I'd recommend that you don't do displacement work. You know, one of the biggest lessons I learned was to stop doing displacement. Like everybody else, I was doing displacement work. You know, I'm busy and I've solved a few small problems, but the business would still go down while I was doing that. You've got to go to what's your biggest problem today, apply those techniques to it. And you might find actually it's quite tractable, or it reveals new insights that you didn't previously think about. And in time, as your business grows, or depending what size your business is today, move that from being your capability to being an organization-wide capability, trying to create more people who think the way you're now thinking, because that will dramatically amplify your effectiveness. You know, there's only ever one of you, there's always more of everybody else. So if you can get those people to be thinking the way you're thinking, that makes an enormous difference, because they'll solve problems before you even knew there were problems, and you're never on the front line anymore after a certain point. So that's what I would say for practical application. And you know, in conclusion, we've looked at these 4 areas. We've looked at them statically, and then we've looked at some of the dynamics around them. There's probably others you could add in here, variations on them. People might disagree the exact classification I've used and so on, and that's fine, and probably there are much better classifications. The point is, the meta point of today is that you need to start thinking about productivity and operational efficiency as a concrete discipline that you can handle. If you don't, you'll end up eventually iterating towards stagnation, really. So it's a really important skill to have in your arsenal as you grow. So, you know, whether or not this is your flavor of it or you do it differently, activate the subject in your thinking is my meta point. And remember that if everything's going well, that's only a precursor to it not going well. And that's why making this a way of life rather than just a kind of one-off exercise that was quite, you know, interesting for a week is super, super important. So thank you for that. I hope that was useful. And I think we've got some time for questions, John, if I'm not mistaken, if there's any. No, surely not.
So now it's time to move on to Q&A. I can invite once more the virtual attendees to submit questions. We have quite a few questions already, but if there are more, we're happy to take more. In the first instance, I would like to offer the opportunity to our audience here to ask a question before I go to those no question on Zoom. So, you know,
It's just very changes which have been disappointing in your outcomes.
Undoubtedly, but I think every time you make a change of some sort, it's based on a premise that might be incorrect, and by doing that, you'll get more new information. So I wouldn't say that there's been any time where we tried to go through these processes, made profound changes that turned out to be wildly off. But you learn as you go along, what is the real issue here? So that's why I emphasize iterating. Like, for example, the process improvement stuff, it's an iterative process. You get more information each time round. So that's kind of how I think about that. There's nothing that's wildly turned out to be wrong. I think you minimize the chances of it being wildly wrong is if, as a group, you do the cause and effect discussion. Where you're very likely to be wildly wrong, and this is where I think, like everybody else, I have gone wrong, is something must be done. This is something, so let's do this. The plausible stuff. If you move away from the plausible towards the search for the actual, you're far more likely to be in the right ballpark.
There was some feedback from the virtual attendees that the question wasn't heard good enough, but we'll try to put it on the chat. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you very much for this is very illuminating for me. I come from an academic background, so it's very new and starting a business, film business. So the one question I have is about agency building, because most of the time these days we are working long distance and virtually. So some of the people we work with we don't even know. So it's agency building, particularly under the circumstances, and I imagine this situation is going to be similar in the next maybe couple of years or so. So how to strategize this agency building thing? Because this is one of the things I think businesses like me, very small business like me, with a really, really tiny group of people, and we basically work with freelancers. So how do we do that? How do we strategize?
Okay, well, thank you. Congratulations on starting your business as well. So I remember I've worked in companies where, like when I was in Cisco, the second time I was in Cisco twice, once through acquisition and once by another route. And the second time I was working with a team of about 200 people on a big global project, and I never met any of them. In fact, we didn't even do video calls then. It was all sort of, audio. And it was a really, really good working relationship, and we trusted each other, and we got a lot done together. And other times I've been in the same building where people from, different corners of the office hate each other, don't trust each other. So I don't think I've just sort of developed a viewpoint that we shouldn't automatically assume that remoteness or physical distance is a problem. It brings problems, but very often because we assume that, we stop there. And I think if you assume that it isn't a problem, it's just a certain model, and then go back to the question of those 4 agency points, how do I instill those 4 things in my team? Then you can get pretty far in practice without it being an issue. We did a lot of things in that Cisco team to build a common understanding of the project. Lots of communication, lots of updates on what we were doing, lots of chances to ask questions, lots of ability to have a one-to-one conversation. Just over time, built a common understanding of what we're trying to do. So that got us aligned. I often think you build a lot of agency quickly if you trust people and allow them to make some mistakes, and then don't punitively punish them for those mistakes. I sort of use a model I call license to operate, which is each of us have got a license to operate from other people, and the more successful we are, the bigger that license gets. So if you've just joined, I don't know you at all, then my license to operate I'm going to give you is a bit less, but I need to be conscious that the first thing you do, it goes well. I need to make that license bigger, give you more space. You need to feel I've given you that more space, and so on. But quite often we don't move from the original short license, so I think that's quite a good concept to have between you explicitly. I want to build trust me, I want to give you as much agency as possible. I can't give you all on day one because I don't know you yet, and my brand's at risk here. Let's talk about how we expand your license to operate. Just make it upfront, and people want to, people like that metaphor, I think, and it's because it's going in the right direction. So I think if you do those things, if you remember those 4 quadrants on agency and just say, how would I do those in the virtual world? And don't assume the virtual world makes it undoable, just assume that you'll do it a different way. You'll get pretty far with that. So strategy sessions, a great way to make a remote meeting work is keep it reasonably short and make it, have a laugh, bring humor back in. Like, how's your day? Well, let me tell you, just allow humanity to come in. And that refreshes people and keeps them focused. So I think if you recognize that, people need regular breaks and these things, and don't make it a meeting they dread because it's a strategy meeting, then you'll get a lot of energy from people. And I think that's one way I do it. I don't have any perfect solution, but I found that works really, really well. Try and keep fun and joy in what you do. If there's no joy in what people are doing, they're never going to come up with great ideas, and they're just going to endure. You don't want your team to endure your meetings. You want them to engage in those meetings.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
No worries.
Good. Please speak up because the virtual attendees cannot hear the question. You can hear Mark, but you hear very well the questions.
Okay, thank you, Mark, for inspiring your speech. It was so nice to see all these leadership backgrounds and conceptual frameworks included in your talk. My question is more related with emerging technologies, because if you look at all these discussions, companies are saying they need to invest in innovation, innovate to increase their productivity. But if you look at emerging technologies like virtual reality, 5G, 6G now, and some other new technologies, we don't see how this reflecting productivity really takes a couple of years. You can see what will be the ways to make more linkages between emerging technologies and productivity.
Thank you, Nuran. So just in case people didn't hear that question, I won't do it quite justice, Nuran, but Nuran was asking essentially about the relationship between emerging technologies that are labeled as productivity-oriented technologies and actual productivity in a business. So quite often we invest in productivity tools and emerging tools, you mentioned 5G, etc., but we don't necessarily see more productivity. Is that fair? Yeah, coming out of that. My personal view as a practitioner is that, I always used to say to people, I worked in the technology sector, and I'd say that technology is not a technology problem, it's a people problem. So you can build anything you like, pretty much within reason, if you can conspire to agree to do it together. So I think that undoubtedly tools like video conferencing, are helpful towards productivity. Of course, it would no means to communicate remotely would have productivity challenges, but the bulk of where productivity issues come in are in the systems that people operate within. And you can add new tools and take tools out of that, but putting new tools into an unproductive environment is not effective in raising productivity. It just makes the non-productivity go faster. I can tell you faster and more easily that everything sucks, So I think you've got to start from the system piece and how people operate within a system, such as we've talked about today, and then the exact technologies and tools used around that are an embellishment of that, a second order issue rather than a first order issue. If you've got like a process that's broken because there's not enough engineers, for example, or because of something like that, then you're still going to have that problem if you've invested in communication technologies to talk to each other about that problem. So start from the system, that's where the big wins are, I think. And the technology is a helpful secondary benefit.
Hi, I really liked the dimension you did between plausible and actual problems. And I was saying in our conversation, we've got like an extra layer, I think, which is perceived problems. And I was just wondering how the perception problems kind of interplays with the difference between plausible and action, because for us, we can't get rid of this to actually fix.
Yeah, no, thank you. So just to repeat that, we talked in one of the slides about the difference between plausible and actual, but your question was, in your business, you've also got a third element, which is perceived problems that actually aren't problems, and a lot of energy goes into those, I guess. So I think perceived problems is another way of saying plausible. It's another way, if it's not actually a problem, but it's perceived, then someone's offered it up as the reason something isn't happening. So it's just another category of plausible. We can't get more stuff done because of X. X is a problem. I think the way you expose whether something's a problem or not is by these current reality trees, or there's variants of the current reality trees. There's something called the 5 whys. I don't know if you've heard of that. You basically ask why 5 times. So why did the site go down? Because we released a dodgy fix. Why did we release a dodgy fix? Because we didn't test it properly. Why did we not test it properly? Because we haven't got enough test people, and so on. And you very quickly start to get to the truth of things. Whereas in most meetings we stop with just one why. we go to the proximate effects and stop there, the proximate causes, sorry, and stop there. So whether something's a perceived problem or a real problem, if it stands up to a why, 5 whys analysis or a current reality tree, it's probably a real symptom. And if it disappears during that process, then that tells you that it was just a phantom. But it really is just another class of plausible. Someone's told you that's the problem. That problem's causing this problem, and those things melt away under proper, cause and effect analysis. Cause and effect's an interesting thing because we often say something's too complicated to analyze, or it's just really, really complicated. But what we mean often is that the mechanistic complexity is high, like the economy is awfully complicated, or that machine that does the air conditioning is complicated. But cause and effect is often much simpler, and what you care about is cause and effect. So if I put up interest rates, inflation will go down. There's a lot of complexity in there, but that's the cause and effect of it. So I used to use an example that with our CFO, I got on very well with our CFO. He's a complex individual. He's got a lot of thoughts, emotions, and relationships, and all that stuff. But despite all that mechanistic complexity that our CFO had, if I went up in the office and punched him in the face, the effect of that would be he'd probably punch me back, and he's much bigger than me. So the cause and effect was very simple, even though the mechanistics were very complicated. So I think cause and effect analysis is very helpful in breaking through myths and beliefs. A lot of these phantom reasons come from people living in the mechanistic. This is also complicated, and it must be because it's Friday and it's a full moon, So I think these things go away if you apply that kind of model.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So I will move on to some of the questions that we have from our online audience. There is a very common thing that's feeding through with us to do with remote and hybrid working practices that perhaps are here to stay or for the foreseeable future. And so a lot of business owners are wondering, how we can ensure the same or even boost up productivity in such an environment, how we can engage employees, which I guess relates to your concepts of agency. So yeah, this is this one question that is really fitting through various forms from many business owners. So if you have a go at this,
yeah, sure. So it's interesting. I remember just before the pandemic hit, there was a number of businesses I was working with, and they were debating about, could you trust people to work from home? And the general answer was, no, you couldn't really, not really. Some of them, but not really. You can trust me to work from home, but you couldn't trust anybody else to work from home, that sort of thing. And then they had to send everybody home. And for a period of time, their productivity went up massively. Even although some of those people were heavily challenged with their home environment, on average, it went up massively. And they're very disorientated by this. And then, people started thinking, great, let's close our offices and all that stuff. And then they found that people started to be less productive because people were starting to get a bit dispirited and despondent and so on. I think the reason we saw productivity rise when we did see it rise for those people for whom it did rise is because of maker time versus manager time. In a lot of roles, suddenly I had deep time, I had deep work. I could spend the afternoon working on stuff and get a lot done. And I think that, however we reconstitute ourselves once we get to equilibrium with COVID, let's put it that way, it's obviously not going away, but once we get to equilibrium, I think we've got to reflect on that demonstration of the power of maker time. And it might be that the answer is hybrid working and people use being home to have maker time. And if that's the case, do not send them home to sit on Zoom calls all afternoon, because I think that's where the dispirited stuff starts to really kick in. I'm in my house talking to faces on a screen that's so abstract and it's exhausting. I'm constantly being scrutinized and the camera's watching me, and if I put my camera off, I think I've went off somewhere, and it's a lot of stress. So I think one way we could design our work environments is to embrace maker time and orientate a lot of that to when people aren't in the office, and then get the benefits of that. and then let people in the office later for the humanist contact, the manager time, the meetings that they have to have. That's not what we're doing just now. We're just saying, great, Zoom. It goes back to Nuran's question about technology. We've got Zoom, let's continue as normal. But I mean, does anybody wake up in the morning and go, oh, great, I've got 6 Zoom meetings today? You know, nobody does that. But if you said, great, I've got the whole morning to work on something, get that report finished, and I'll go into the office tomorrow, I actually feel okay about that. So that's I don't know if that answers the question, but I think build around maker time and align that with when you're at home would be one way you could approach it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Mark. So I'm going to go back now to the focus on the appeal of the one constraint, thinking about the one constraint. So we may think in some situations, perhaps the multi-product company that would have bottlenecks in different domains of the company. So could we generalize that thinking that we could perhaps have small teams attack, one constraint at a time, and then have all of them together work collaboratively to cut through the intensities? Do you think that this is generalizable?
Well, I think that the first thing is you're going to have a lot of processes in your company. I call some of them golden processes, like the 3 processes roughly that define your business. Finding customers, delivering service to customers, and building the stuff that lets you do those 2 things. These are your 3 golden processes, and each of those will have one constraint at a time. So you can certainly work on all 3 of them simultaneously with different teams. I think you can also have a model where you do constraint analysis. You say that's the current constraint, and we anticipate this will be the one after that, and set up 2 teams to work on that. But you've got to be careful with that because you might be wrong. So you can get some parallelization. I think that in terms of people coming back together, a company that is intensively built into how it works, process optimization, will come back regularly to say, where are we now? And I think that's healthy. But when you start doing this in a business of any size, you'll usually find that 95% of the people in the company are totally against this exercise. Because it's inconvenient for them, because a process cuts across multiple departments, and you're saying, could we stop those product managers building or raising new features, or those salespeople from hitting their sales targets so they slow down a bit so don't overload engineers, and maybe have them do some testing for us? The answer is absolutely not. So when you start this stuff, it's very inconvenient for some people, and that's why it needs senior sponsorship. Once you start to show the benefits of it and people come around and the culture changes, then you can start to have multiple teams, and you can think of governance to manage that. But always you must keep in mind that for any single process, there is only one constraint. You want 2 different teams working the same process, except under very close coordination.
Okay, thanks for that, Mark. So there's another question. Well, actually, question has to do with scale up with SMEs, and this theme actually manifests in different dimensions. So it might be the product line dimension, or the employee, the people's dimension. And one question, one particular specific question in this was how you scale up effectively while retaining quality of service or product and the client relationships.
Mm-hmm. So I think it depends on the speed you're trying to scale, of course. Within a certain speed, there's no reason why you can't do that. Quite often, where it breaks down is we're scaling faster than we had planned to scale, and the process and the structure and the people haven't kept up. So back to our inflection point case. So I think one thing you can do, which we did, and it was very helpful, is at any point in time say, what does this company need to look like a year from now? With our current trajectory, what does it need to look like a year from now? That's really important, because there are some things that you can't react to in a couple of days and fix. Some things are going to break. So if you are, with Skyscanner, we were doubling at one point our customer base every year, and we were growing the team every 6 months. And we couldn't afford to hire people and then see what broke and then try to fix that because it might take too long. So we had to think about, let's imagine this business a year from now, what would it need to have in it, and then work back from there. And you can decide how bold to be. You might say, let's assume we're going to grow enormously. What would it look like? Or not very much. What would it look like? But I think doing that can preempt some of the scalability issues we've just talked about. You might say, for example, we're going to have, let's make up a number, 500 employees next year. Our current payroll system isn't going to work above 300, so we're going to have to invest now in another one. That's a way to head off problems. So ditto with customer handling tools and so on and so forth. So I would sort of, there's a lot we could talk about at that point, but I would urge people to always say, what does a year from now look like? You might be wrong, but at least it gets you actively thinking about where the future bottlenecks might be.
Thank you, Mark. I'm just typing in the question again because some of the audience online couldn't hear that. Okay. Brilliant. Okay, let me move on to the next question. So there is a question about fear of digital, and we have some evidence, sometimes anecdotal, that certainly in Scotland and other parts of the UK, companies are slow to adapt to digital, especially on the small to medium segment. And is there what's your advice on this? I mean, how can they embrace that and make that work for them?
So I think that's a specific class of a general problem, which is we often fall into the trap of only learning from our own experience, from internally. So we iterate on what we do. We're trying to improve. We're all trying to improve, but we're iterating on our own best practice. And if you don't have, I'm not sure if Zoom's a good example, but let's say if you don't use Zoom and you're still using Skype or something like that, or you're not using anything like that, you're using calls, then if you only look internally, you're just going to continue to do that. You might get a nicer phone or a bigger star phone, but you're never going to move past that. But that's a general problem where, I always used to say to people that the chances of best practice existing in your company right now is precisely zero. Just statistically speaking, it's not a criticism, because there's, I don't know how many companies are in the world, let's say 1 million companies. So you're one of those companies. So there's a 0.0001% chance that you've got best practice, just statistically. So it's really important to train the company and yourself to constantly look outwards to say, what is the best practice in our industry? And can we, or in other industries, and can we have that here? Whether that be, digital adoption, or, things we've talked about here, or something else entirely, or how you organize your team. And I think if you don't do that, you'll end up iterating on your best practice until you reach a plateau. If you want to really, continue to drive the company's growth and performance, you've got to seek out worldwide best practice. And that's easy to do because we've got the internet and people very generously describe what they're doing. So I would just urge any company to just look out the way and really do that in an open way. I mean, I remember, for example, we went to see LinkedIn to ask them how they did continuous delivery. And they very generously told us, because they were one of the pioneers at the time. And we went to see Spotify and asked them how they structured their team, because we'd heard that was really good. If we tried to design that and invent it ourselves, we wouldn't have invented it. We'd have added to our existing structure. So digital is just the same. It's just what's best practice. By all means, ask yourself, is it best practice? But be open to the idea it might be, and always assume that best practice more often than not exists outside your company than inside. Even if occasionally that's not true, you're just more likely to develop faster.
One more question.
Sure.
So the question is, it has to do with staff retention and the ability of SMEs to actually find the right skills and the right people to scale up. So this is a particular particular problem in Scotland and the other regions of the UK as well. But I was wondering, is there anything that you offer as an insight or as an advice from your experience at Skyscanner? How did you deal with staff attrition and staff retention issues? How did you manage this process? And it's very, it will become more of an issue, I guess, as we move out of this COVID. And certain sectors are being shut down or being scaled down, while other sectors are scaling up faster, so that the capacity to grow. So, if you have any examples or any insights?
Sure. Yeah, so I'd say maybe 2 or 3 quick things on that. The first thing is, if you're growing a company in Scotland, depending on what sector you're in, above a certain level of experience, you're not going to find those people in Scotland, and you have to grow them yourself. So, we in Skyscanner, we couldn't hire a Silicon Valley engineering, architect into Edinburgh or Glasgow, because there's just not enough Skyscanners for them to take the risk in case it doesn't work out. So they stay where they are. So we grew our own people, and we invested heavily in those people, time, space, money where we could afford to. Eventually a lot of those people, we couldn't afford to hire them back at 3 times the price, so it does work. So embrace the fact that we've got a strong talent pool here. People tend to move job less often here than they do in London. So if you invest in someone and it's a good place to work, they'll stay, so it's worth the investment. Whereas in London, you'll tend to find people moving around, even every 6 months in some sectors. So you play the position that's on the board, and every position has strengths and weaknesses. In Scotland, we've got talented people, in general, less experience above a certain point, but more likely to stay with your business if you invest time and energy and money in them. And therefore you can compete. So we grew a lot of our own leaders. I used to always say, at any point in time, half of our future leaders are already in this business. We just have to identify which half and support them. So I think that's one way to think about it. The second thing is, people worry about, big companies will steal your employees because you've trained them up and they'll go. And that's certainly a bit of truth in that. Skyscanner had, Google and Uber trying to poach your employees, amongst others. But you've always got strengths in a position. And, if I take our example, a graduate engineer would get more money in Google than they would in Skyscanner. But on the other hand, they would never be let near the product for the first 3 years of their lives in Google. They'd be moving pixels in a product that was never live, whereas in Skyscanner, they'd be working on the fundamental engine of the product. So that's attractive. Good engineers wanted to work on hard problems, especially early on in their careers. So, you can find ways to differentiate yourself in the job market. And we hired a lot of people who would have gone to Google, in other circumstances. I think in terms of how you retain people, people talk a lot about culture. And I think culture is 3 things. It's partly strategy. It's what you believe that's made you successful. So that's a category. It's partly hygiene stuff, like, do you have 3 cans of Coke in the fridge and, yoga classes on a Wednesday? But the most important, these things are important, but by far the most important thing in terms of retention is psychological safety. Do I feel safe in this environment to grow, develop, make mistakes, learn? Are the people around me trying to make me successful, or are they trying to screw me over? All that kind of stuff. So Google did some very interesting research in their own company about why some teams perform much better than others inside Google. And what they discovered was the teams with the highest psychological safety performed the best. And what I tried to do in Skyscanner was make this an environment that was high performance and had high expectations, but was also psychologically a safe environment. And I think you'll keep people a long time if you can do those things.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. I think this concludes our Q&A session. Let me now move on to what's going to follow up from this event. So what we're planning to do is to identify 2 issues that have been fed back through your through the problems you fed back to us through the registration process, but also through the event itself. And then what we will do is we will select 2 companies and we will set the 2 days in October, and Mark will offer his expertise to try and apply this framework and try to address 2 specific problems from your business. So we will be in touch about that in the next couple of weeks, I would think, to the dates. And let me remind everyone again that this has been recorded and will be uploaded. We can watch it again as well as the online attendees. The last thing I want to mention is that we would like you to, we have designed a digital capabilities, digital opportunity survey. It's an online survey. It takes 15 minutes to complete. And we would like to ask you to complete that survey because it's going to help us to understand what the needs are and what we can offer in terms of an execution plan to help you enjoy the digital transformation journey. I know some of your businesses are thinking about that already, so that'll be a great opportunity if you can have your engagement on this. I think that's all for today. That was a magnificent session. Thank you very much, Mark, again for the great insights and the great advice and the simplicity of the diagnostics and the tools. And I think everyone can benefit from this. So our message to you is productivity is not about working harder, it's about working smarter. And I think these tools and the framework today means that we can start the journey on working smarter. And I wish all the best of success to all the businesses and to our physical attendees today and our online attendees as well. And we will be in touch with you